Hey guys, and welcome to another PyQt6 tutorial here on the Coder's Legacy channel. In this video, we'll talk about layout management in PyQt6. Alright, so if you've been following my tutorial series so far, you may have noticed that we make a video on every single widget. Okay, we talk about that widget, we talk about its different options, different parameters, different signals, different styles that we can apply, etc. But there's a slight flaw with this approach if you try, learning through this approach. For example, if I make 10 videos on 10 different widgets and you watch all those 10 videos, that's not enough. Okay, it's not enough to just know how to create individual widgets and how to use those widgets. Okay, at most, you'll be able to create a functioning GUI application that has the required functionality, but there's a big flaw here. There's a big gap in your knowledge, and that's with regards to layout management. Alright, layout management is what, it's like the glue that sticks all those widgets together. You've made like a big GUI application, you have like 10-20 widgets in there, but there's no layout to it. You've just, they're all haphazard across the place. It's not scalable. You'll try resizing the window and suddenly everything will look weird. Like the widgets won't move. Whenever you resize it, you make the window smaller maybe, and then the widgets just disappear. Like they'll go out of the window basically, they won't be visible anymore. Or if you resize the window and make it much larger, then there'll be a lot of empty space and the widgets will be somewhere in a corner. There's so many different problems that can occur, and all of this is occurring because you didn't use layout management. Okay, and that's why I just want to really emphasize on this fact that layout management is a really big deal. Okay, and it's if you make any medium to large sized application, it's like a must. Okay, you need to have it. The alternative to layout management is absolute positioning, which you guys may have used earlier. Basically, it's when you use the move command. Okay, let me just show you that. And if I just do self over here, then you would do button.move, and then you would pass in the coordinates at which you want it to be. Okay, this is the concept of absolute positioning, and this unfortunately is a flawed approach. It won't work outside of small demos or small applications. Okay, anytime you want flexibility, scalability, and just a generally good application, okay, that actually has a cohesive layout between its widgets, you want to use layout managers instead. So let's elaborate a bit more on absolute positioning before we move on to layout managers. Absolute positioning is a valid approach, but there are a few problems associated with it. Okay, let me just create a few more widgets and then we'll take a look at exactly why there are some problems, okay, and why we need to use a different approach. Okay, so if I run this code here with these 3 buttons, now the problem is that if I resize the window and make it larger, these did not change. Okay, neither the size of the widgets changed, neither its position on the screen. Okay, those 2 things remain the same. Now this is actually a problem. Like, to name one application that you've used where you have resized it and the size and the position of the elements did not change with it. I don't think you could name any, because there isn't anyone who makes applications that way, and it's not responsive, it's not a good idea, and there are many problems associated with it that you'll only realize once you actually try using an application like that. Okay, now here's another problem. If I make it smaller, okay, what happens is that we no longer see the other 2 widgets, okay, and this is a massive problem. So instead of maybe the widgets becoming closer to each other, like the spacing between them reducing or the size of the widget decreasing in order to fit the window, instead of that happening, what happened is that the 2 widgets just disappeared. Okay, so these are just a few problems, and layout managers come with all kinds of features, all kinds of functions, spacing. You can define spacing between widgets and all that, and we'll discuss that right now. Alright, so let's start by importing some layouts. Alright, we'll be discussing 3 of them in today's video. And this technique that I'm using here, by the way, is a good, it's handy when you're making a lot of imports. Alright, it doesn't make things cluttered. Okay, so VBoxLayout, HBoxLayout, and QGridLayout. These are the 3 layouts that we'll discuss in today's video. Alright, so let's start off with VBox Layout. Now, as the name suggests, it's a vertical box layout. All right, what this means is that we're going to have widgets vertically stacked on top of each other. Okay, now what does this mean? Let's just create a few widgets and then we'll see exactly what happens. All right, so okay, now usually we would pass self in here, right? But this time we're not going to do that. Okay, the reason we pass self in there is to tell the PyQt6 application that this button is a part of this window. Okay, and that this window is the parent of the button. But we're not going to do that, and let me tell you why. Because first we're going to create the layout, okay, and then we're going to hold on. Parentheses, okay, then we'll do self, which refers to the window. Self means our window over here, which is a Q widget. Self.set layout, and then we'll do VBox. Okay, so what we just did is set this layout as the layout for our window. Okay, now just so you know, we can actually add in more layouts later on. Okay, this doesn't mean that we can only add one layout per window. We can actually have one main layout, and then we can have layouts within that layout. So you can think of this as the parent layout, and in the future, if we want to add more layouts, then we can just add them within this layout. Okay, I'll talk more about that later. So let me just finish this first. I'm going to do, we don't need to do move anymore. So what I'll do is VBox dot add widget. Okay, now this is a bit of a hassle, but you need to add in every widget into the VBox layout, okay, or any layout that you create actually. So yeah, that's all there is to it. There are some additional parameters and we'll discuss those later. Okay, so let's run this code and let's see if we're getting some output. Okay, there's our button. Okay, and the reason why there's some padding on the sides, by the way, is because of this function over here. We've set some margins between the layout and the edge of the windows. The reason why there's so much spacing between the button and the window is because of this function over here. It sets some padding between the window and the stuff within the window. All right, so it's handy. It adds some spacing, makes it look better. All right, just my personal preference. So let's add in a few more widgets now. All right, I'll just copy this over and we'll add in a few more. All right. So if I run this code now, we get this window over here that has these three buttons. Okay, and they're vertically stacked on top of each other. We didn't specify their position. We did nothing except add them into the vertical box layout. And after that, everything is the responsibility of the vertical box layout. It's going to manage everything. Okay, now watch. If I increase the size, okay, notice that the buttons resized automatically. Okay, and by extension, their positions also changed. If I do this, then the spacing between them increases. All right. Now, you may not entirely want this. Okay, like sometimes you may not want it to increase past a certain width, or you may not want it to increase at all. There are many different options and parameters, and you can all adjust that over here. All right, just look at this. I'm going to do VBox dot, and you can see a whole bunch of functions over here. Okay, let me just find some relevant ones like set. Okay, just type set, and then we can get content margins. Okay, we can set the alignment, we can set geometry. We don't need to do that, so we don't need to set the size. We can set the size constraint. We can set the spacing between the widgets. Okay, so remember how in the start the buttons were a bit close to each other. So if I just do this, for example, then they'll end up with more space. Let me just make that a bit more apparent. I'll increase this to 50, and you'll see that the initial spacing is like 50 pixels between each. Okay, you can also adjust the horizontal spacing. We can't. Okay, I think that was on the QGrid layout then, not on the VBox layout. Okay, so yeah, we can adjust spacing over there. And what else? What else? There's stretch as well. That's a topic for another time. Yeah, a bunch of other cool stuff in here, and maybe we'll talk about that later because this is a whole bunch of features and functionality. But for simple use cases, what I've just shown you right now is enough. Okay, there are other things we can do. For example, you can specify the alignment. Okay, so what you could do, first we need to import from PyQt6.qtcore. You need to import Qt, and what this gives you is a bunch of alignment flags that you can use. All right, alignment flag dot align bottom, align center, align edge. All right, so for example, let me make one of them align right. Let's make another one of them align left. All right, and there's a whole bunch of stuff like this. It just depends on how far you want to go and how complex your application is. So the more complex it is, the more time you spend on it, the more you'll learn about how these work. All right, so yeah, now currently if I run this, you won't really notice any difference. Okay, and that's of course, yeah. The thing is that there are many different things, size policies and all that. Do check that out. To summarize this in easy words, what happened was that instead of expanding to fill all the available space, we've now given it an alignment. Okay, so now instead of its default behavior to just expand, okay, and use up that space that's available to it now because it's been resized. So instead of doing that, it's now going to align itself with that extra space. All right, so that's basically how it works. All right, and this can be a bit tricky once you try adding in a bunch of options, but practice makes perfect. So yeah, definitely something you need to work a lot with before you get the hang of it. All right, now let's just try one more thing. Okay, let me resize this to like 400. Okay, and yeah, okay, so just a point I wanted to prove that you don't need to resize the window yourself. Okay, these buttons, this one and this one, the first and third buttons, are at their default size, and the middle button is doing its default behavior, which is controlled by the layout, which is to basically expand to fit all available space. Okay, so for example, if I just change their alignment behavior, it's going to change its behavior, and let me just change this to align center and watch the magic. All right, there you go. So if I resize this now, you can see how it changes. Okay, and you'll notice that I can't actually make it smaller beyond this point, and that's of course because the layout won't let you make it smaller past that point, because then the widgets won't be displayed correctly. Okay, so yeah, this is just a good overview on what layouts do for you, and there's a whole bunch of other stuff. Okay, like I said, there's a whole bunch of other options you can use. All right, so yeah, and of course we have other layouts to cover, so let's move on. All right, so let me talk about HBox now. Okay, now let's just leave all these settings intact, or actually let's just remove these alignments. Okay, let me just convert these first from V to H. Okay, and let me just remove these alignments, and let's run the code. Oh, and by the way, HBox actually means horizontal box. So if you already didn't pick it up, basically HBox is like the reverse of vertical box. Instead of stacking them vertically, what it does is stacks them, or more like places them side by side. Okay, so horizontally. So if I run this, what's up with that? Oh, of course. I changed the name, I didn't change the class being used. Okay, so if I change this now, we now have 3 buttons that are side by side. Pretty cool, right? So yeah, you can, I'm sure you guys can already see where you might be using these layouts. Okay, get those creative juices running. So yeah, and let me just show you something before we move on to the QGrid layout. Let me just show you how we can combine 2 layouts. Okay, because the QGrid layout isn't something you would normally combine widgets with. It's pretty vast, the QGrid layout. Okay, so for example, what kind of situation would be where I would want to add a new layout? Let's say that we have 2 divides. Okay, we want to divide our window into 2 parts. Okay, we have that kind of application running. Maybe in one of them I want to have 3 buttons side by side. In one of them I want to have 3 buttons vertically stacked. Okay, let's try and do that. All right, I know what to do. First, I'm going to create 3 layouts in total. All right, just watch. I'm going to create this HBox layout over here. Okay, let's not touch that. I'm going to create a new layout over here. Okay, I'll just call it layout, and it'll be a VBox layout. Okay, then I'll do self.setLayout to layout. Now I'm going to duplicate this, all right, and just put this over here, change this to VBox, okay, because I want three buttons vertically and I want 3 buttons horizontally, all right. So I'll just change that. Now we have 3 layouts, okay, 1, 2, and 3, okay. But currently I haven't added these 2 layouts to our main layout, okay. So let's do that right here. What I'll do is layout.addWidget, and I'm going to just add that layout, and the same thing down here. All right, so we now have these 2 layouts which each have 3 widgets inside of them added to our main layout. So if I run this and it's giving me an error, why? Something about an unexpected parameter. Okay, so my bad, we just needed to change this from widget to layout. Alright, alright, so just change that from widget to layout and run this, and there we go. Alright, so here's our layout, and let me just explain what's going on here. We have these 3 buttons over here, and that's our HBox layout, okay, because we added the HBox layout first, and then we added the VBox layout, so it's down there. Basically, there's a division over here, okay, because we created the main layout that we created is a VBox layout, so it occupies this whole window. And because we added 2 elements, okay, it basically gave half of it to the first one and half of it to the second one. All right, that's basically how this is working right now, okay. And beyond that, I think you guys understand this, and you know, it's just what we discussed earlier: 3 buttons side by side, 3 buttons stacked on top of each other. Okay, there isn't really much to explain here, and yeah, this is just how you combine layouts within each other, and this is something that's very important whenever you're building a more complex application. Okay, so yeah, now let's move on to the final layout, which is the QGrid layout. Okay, so it's pretty cool and one of my personal favorites. So let's just change this from VBox Layout to QGrid Layout, and let's get started. Let's create some buttons again. Okay, I should really stop deleting them so often. Let's just create them, and I'll add them. Actually, let me just create a few of them first. Okay, let's create 4, and I'll change their names this time, because using a slightly different approach here. 2 and 3 and 4. Great. So we have these 4 buttons now, and now I want to add them to my layout. How will I do that? Well, the QGrid layout is a bit more complicated. Okay, you can't just do add widget and then you can't just pass button 1 in here. Okay, that's not enough. All right, you need to specify a position. Okay, now let me just explain what the QGrid layout is. Basically, it's a combination of rows and columns. Okay, now it's kind of like a combination of the VBox layout and the HBox layout in a sense. Basically, it's like a table. You know how a table has cells, like the cell at the first row and the second column, or the cell at the third row first column? You know how that works? It's basically like that. So you can basically specify a row and a column that you want a widget to be located at. Okay, so for example, let me just place this button at the 0th row, and you can see the parameters mentioned over here. Okay, so this is first is row, second is column. The first button can be located at 0, 0, okay, which is the first cell in the table. Okay, let's then add button 2 at the next location, let's say column 1. Then let's add button 3 to, we could add it into column 3. Sorry, this is column 1. Technically column 2 but for the sake of being constant, let's just call them column 0, column 1, and column 2. All right, let's just call them that way for now. All right, now I could add this to column 2, but let me just try and keep this a bit more uniform. Or you know what, let's just go ahead and do it. Okay, I'll just create it like this, and let me just run this code now, and we now have these 4 buttons side by side. And let me just remove that, by the way, we don't need that anymore. Okay, so yeah, here are our 4 buttons, and they're side by side. Okay, but that's not because of the fact that this is HBox layout or something. It's because we manually set it that way. There are basically 4 cells in here: cell 1, cell 2, cell 3, and cell 4. What we can do is completely change this and set it up in a different manner, like this. See? Pretty cool, right? Now there are also 4 cells over here: 1, 2, 3, and 4. Okay, but this is like a table. A table can be a single row with 4 columns. It could be 2 rows and 2 columns, or it could be 4 columns, 1 row. Wait, that's the same thing as what I said earlier. It could be 4 rows, 1 column, and so on. Okay, the possibilities are limitless. Okay, you could make this function as a VBox layout. You could make it function as a HBox layout. You could make it function as something entirely unique. Okay, and there's other cool stuff in here as well. Like, let's add in a new button. All right, let's add in a 5th button. Okay, now let's say I want this button to be a bit larger than the rest. If I want it to be larger, what I could do is that instead of trying to manually change the size, which is something I do not recommend in a QGrid layout, you need to basically change the amount of space it's allocated. Okay, by default, every widget is allocated 1 cell. Okay, like they're allocated 1 column and 1 row of space. We can increase that amount though to like 2 cells, okay, or 3 or 4. For example, let's say I want this button to be twice as wide as the other buttons. What I could do is pass in 0, pass in 1 and pass in 2. And what these 2 new parameters are the row span and the column span. Okay, the row span is basically something I want to keep as 1, and the column span I want to keep as 2. What this does is 1 means that it'll stay the same size, it'll use 1 cell vertically, and column span 2 means that it'll use 2 cells horizontally. So if I run this now, oh wait, hold on, big mistake. I need to change this to a new position. Okay, and there you go. Okay, I made it start from the 2nd row. Okay, this is the 2nd row. Okay, this is the 0th row, the 1st row, the 2nd row, and this is the 0th column. Now instead of taking just 1 cell, okay, it took up 2 because I defined the column span as 2. So if you're interested in the QGrid layout, I do recommend you read up more on it, because we haven't covered everything about it in this tutorial, because there's a bit too much to cover in a video like this that's about layout management in general. Alright, so I do hope I give you guys a good idea on what layout management is, what absolute positioning is, on how the 3 main layout managers work, their benefits, their uses, their pros and cons. Alright, I hope you guys learned something in this video, and yeah. If you like this content and want to see more in the future, make sure to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, leave a comment, let me know what you thought, and I'll see you guys hopefully in another video.